we've seen change.
Mhm.
Give an example of a change. NIH has changed the way that we do foreign subawards, a recent change. Um, they certainly are hoping to, I think, reduce the number of foreign subawards and plan on turning many of those things where they wish to continue the activity into direct awards by the NIH. You could see, because there's a new requirement, you could see an audit out there looking at, foreign activity to see, are people complying with that? Have people um, turned, said, oh, we don't have a sub, but they have something that looks a whole lot like a sub and they're trying to get around. So remember, if you've changed the regulation, they may be looking to provide that. I'll, by the way, address the question. Can you give an example of a case where more documentation for a given expense was required than previously? Um, on a transaction level, I cannot come up with that, but certainly the whole defend the spend effort is a requirement for additional documentation. It's documentation in terms of providing information. We're not asked for backup, but uh, that's an example. I think generally from what I've seen in audits, um, the change in the type of documentation has been slow. You do get asked for more and more, but um, I have not seen that from the federal auditors. I've seen that from other auditors where uh, the where they're looking for what I'll call end-to-end testing of a transaction, where they don't just want to see. I've seen that from the federal auditors too, but they don't just want to see that you have um, that check left your institution to pay the vendor. They want to see that the vendor cashed it, or they want to see that the ACH left your bank account. Or, and these are frustrating to me because they're very labor intensive to do this. And to me, it's also a little bit of pushing into someone else's privacy. They're asking to see someone's pay stub to see if, how do we know this person was paid this amount? Show us their pay stub. And, I'm not thrilled with pay stubs because there's a lot of information on there. But that's a case where I've seen growth in the types of documentation. So again, this is, um, an example. Roseanne, did you have something to add to that?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, and I know we're going to get into it when we talk about some of the audits that we'll talk about, but particularly, I'm curious, Jeff, we're going to look at a couple of the recent audits that were related to subrecipient monitoring and, subaward management. And I feel the nature of those audits and the, required documentation or the level to which those audits reviewed those areas, I feel like they're a little bit more than I feel like I had seen in the past. Diving into fringe benefit rates of the sub and driving into the application of that. I feel like that's a little bit more than I'd seen in the past. I think maybe, so would you think that that's maybe another example of that?
Yeah, I think so. And a lot of this is not necessarily a new requirement, but as you say, it's a greater enforcement. Give an example that, we'll talk about when we talk about the cases. Um, the auditors are now looking at, with NSF auditors typically are looking at publications and seeing within the publication the funding sources that are cited. And if four funding sources are being cited, they're saying, why do you only charge this publication to one? Now, one of the things that we know is that, allocation of expense, any reasonable allocation methodology is acceptable, but it has to be documented. So maybe the reason that's only charged for one is, well, this work was done in the last 10 years and, those grants have termed and this was the capstone grant. and we're citing all of them because they all supported this 10-year body. But if we're not documenting that allocation, or maybe something just supported a tiny little bit and not the publication, maybe that was our reason. But again, it has to be documented, and that's a big thing. And we'll talk about that as an example.